to be resilient in the face of grief, grief for loss of someone else, grief for the loss of your own health. I think the grief that comes with aging and having to let go, the grief in contemplating your own impending death, grief in the pain of others, including people you love and people that you don't know. We just feel grief for the world. And then there's many other things that set us back and can take over our inner life. There's all kinds of things, not as sad as grief, but of course there's anger and there's resentment and there's guilt and shame. So many things in the inner life that if we don't regulate our inner lives well, they come up and they take over what I'm going to call our flow of consciousness. I call our natural state. This is not unique to me. Many people call our natural flow of consciousness by a few words. I like to use the 4 A's, that we're aware of our environment. We're attuned to what's going on. We are accountable if we make a mistake, and we can adapt well. So I call that the A state. And unfortunately, when things happen to us that can arouse any of these negative ego states, they can take us over, and we lose a kind of a spiritual resistance to not allow negative ego states to rule our lives, including, I'll say, the positive ego state of grieving well. And people fall into a negative ego state of not grieving well. Sometimes it's holding on to grievances. You'll notice the word grief in grievances. Many people suffer grievous things from other people. And the bad habit of just staying resentful is very, very powerful. And they say it's been a grievous injury. And instead of grief, I'm going to hate. I'm going to be resentful. So I hear this all the time. And then I try to teach a virtue practice, and the virtue practice is, of course, being resilient against the various ego states. Now, I talked last time about the power of virtue. I want to repeat a little bit of that today, and then take it to a deeper level. I'll give you an anecdote about the power of virtue, and this anecdote comes from many, many counseling sessions where a person may have heard one of my classes, heard me on a podcast talk about virtue, rationality, insight, and the cultivation of depth. People have heard about my ideas about wisdom work, that we have to conceive of or imagine ourselves how we want to be the highest functioning self. We have to cultivate the will and the skill to accomplish it, and people fail. They say, yes, I don't want to be reactive. I don't want to get so defensive. I don't want to be full of fear around a hostile person in my life. Many, many things where people can know where they are. They can imagine handling life better. We work out a program, and then they, I'll say, quote unquote, fail. And one thing I always point out is it's not a failure in the sense that there's something wrong with you. It's that cultivating a vision, the will, and the skill is extraordinarily difficult. So here's one mistake. Now, this is in my opinion. I've worked out a program that works for me, works for many other people. I'm not saying it's the only program, it's the only path. It's one that has been effective for me and others. And that is beginning with virtue. Virtue has to do initially with how you speak and how you behave, whether you're feeling it or not. People say it's called acting as if. That's okay with me. But acting as if, for me, doesn't communicate the profound pain and inner upset in acting with virtue. So if we take it to a deeper level, for virtue for me always means whatever raging torrents you have in your inner life. Sometimes it's the raging torrent of anger, or it's the inner torrent of resentment, or something pulling you down. Depression and shame and guilt and regret about the past. There are many things going on inside of us that want to take us from what you might say is an aware state, an attuned state, adaptable, accountable, and the sense that we have an obligation to live life as fully as we can. And that's the one thing missing, this word obligation. When I look at Aristotle and I look at many of the really wonderful books on positive psychology, I was just rereading Martin Seligman's Flourishing. It's his addition to Authentic Happiness. And there's a lot of good ideas in it, and I'm waiting for the word duty to show up. And in my opinion, I don't think we can flourish as human beings unless we have a very strong sense of duty. In fact, you may have heard my quip from many years ago when I was asked by our daughter, what's a meaningful life? And I said, after years of thinking, but I hadn't put it this way, to do your duty, find joy, bliss when possible. When you're not finding joy and bliss, be resilient, right? And know that everything matters. Everything makes a difference. And I want to talk now a little bit about the resilience. So here's something that comes up oftentimes. A person will be working on the virtue practice, and oftentimes with couples, this means not getting angry, not getting defensive, and letting verbal transactions devolve into something bitter. And so you've heard my advice. Don't talk, breathe, go to a script, regulate yourself. Now, what that does is, when you decide not to talk, every urge inside of you to talk hits up against a wall of virtue. It's a very, very difficult thing. If all your life you've been used to talking when you're upset, talking when you're angry, talking when you're defensive, and upon reflection, people realize it doesn't do any good. So that wall of virtue is contrary to how we live and feel. Even our instincts as human beings is to communicate our upset, communicate when we're feeling defensive, communicate when we're feeling angry, except that what is natural for us human beings doesn't do us any good. After a couple of tries, there are many urges that we have that are natural, but we should not act on them. That's obvious to everybody. Just because you feel it doesn't mean you should do it. I mean, one of the worst things that went around in our culture back when I was a young person was, if it feels good, do it. And, I remember thought, well, if it feels good, you maybe want to think about not doing it until you've really, really thought about it. Because a life of virtue really is about containment until you deliberate and ask yourself, is this something I ought to do? Because you can't trust your feelings. Your feelings aren't your thoughts. Your feelings don't have a moral compass. Feelings arise involuntarily, and they oftentimes don't have your, and we'll get to what I mean by your best interest in mind. So virtue, as far as speaking and your comportment, is the beginning, because you're already practicing not allowing your feelings to run your life. It's a first step, but it's an essential step. So here's what happens. A couple will be working on virtue, and one person says, but what's the limit? I think I maybe shared this last week. A person says, but what's the limit? How often can they criticize me in a day where I don't finally just blow up? Rabbi, everybody has a limit. So I've heard that many times. And so I give an analogy from jiu-jitsu, the martial I've been practicing for 24 years, and before that, 20 years of karate. I say, here's what it sounds like to me. I get into a very bad position in jiu-jitsu. Someone really has a choke or has a lock on me, and they're going to finish the choke or they're going to get the arm lock, but I know the escape. And the escape is sometimes intricate with a very strong, talented partner. Okay? So I'll call that, after 10 times of being criticized, when do I explode? Well, after 10 times of being arm locked or put in a triangle or strangled, at one time do I just forget my jiu-jitsu and just spaz out, just freak out, okay? Nobody does that because we rely on the training. There's no point that a person who's trained says, well, now that it's really difficult, I will forget my training. Nobody says that. Then I say to the person, your training is there. So it happens 5 times a day, 10 times a day, or 24 times a day on the clock. You go back to your training. And your training is, don't speak in anger, don't criticize, complain, condemn, or engage in escalating conflict. Don't act on urges to defensiveness. There's a whole set of things. I said, that's the training. And I ask people, ask yourself whether, when you broke from the honor code, when you broke from the training, how did that go for you? And typically people don't say, it was really excellent, our relationship got better, we have a lot more intimacy. Maybe people get what they want, and Remember, I'm not an advocate that your basic drive in life should be to get what you want. Because remember, sometimes our feelings, our urges, our desires are actually not healthy. They may not be bad, but they may not be the best thing for us. And therefore, because you want it, because you feel it, doesn't mean you should act on it. So now we're looking at something that is actually not just regulating our behavior. Remember, that's the wall of virtue. You don't have to think about it. It's just virtue. It's just a don't. The deeper you go, you have to, at the same time, cultivate your moral compass. But what's the good of a moral compass if you can't control acting on your feelings? And so when people say to me, well, how much of this anger or criticism should I take before I blow up? My question is, are you going to trust the training? Are you living by an honor code or not? So it comes down to this. Person says, my wife made me so angry, and that's why I exploded. And in addition, I had an angry father, and I really don't like anger. And in addition, they tell me all these things, who they modeled after and who they're reacting against. And, privately, I'm thinking to myself, why don't you just throw in astrology and sunspots for all the reasons why you did what you did, except the one thing. The one reason you did what you did. Because you haven't decided. You haven't said no. It doesn't matter about my upbringing. It doesn't matter about my angry parent. None of it matters because I made a decision. Now, here's what happens when you make a decision. When you make a decision, that invites the demons. And then you have to face your demons because your demons are used to getting out. Now, when you make a decision, you're saying to the demons, bring it on, I will fight you, but you don't get to get out and make this relationship toxic. That goes for anger and defensiveness. But what about the inner life? Now, it's clear we have a duty not to engage in anger in the 4 C's because it hurts other people. So we have a moral duty not to hurt others. Now, people say, what about defensiveness? Is there a moral duty not to engage in extended defensiveness? And I say yes, because eventually extended defensiveness enrages other people, doesn't make the relationship better, and sometimes a very defensive person finally rages themselves. So what is the duty behind limiting defensiveness if it's not getting anywhere? Because we have a moral duty to make our relationships better. And if you have any behavior and you examine it objectively, you contemplate it, you reason about it, and it's not making the relationship better, and the relationship is something you value and has moral value, which means a good relationship with other people is intrinsically valuable, intrinsically worthwhile. And if you're doing things that hurt it, then you have to stop. It's an obligation. Now, so many people, when they're working on their emotions and feelings, they're not clear that I have an absolute obligation not to let my toxicity come out into the interpersonal space. Now we're going to go to something much more difficult to think about, and that is obligation to the soul. Now, in the many books of positive psychology that I've read, and they're very wise, they're beneficial, even the books on resilience that I've looked over, the idea of the obligation to be resilient is lacking. The duty to be resilient is lacking, because when you talk about obligation, when you talk about duty, the question is obligation to whom? Duty to whom? So when you say duty to the self, that might work. I have a duty to myself, but then you have to define yourself rather carefully. So I want to run with that for a moment. Do I have a duty to myself to not allow myself, I'll say, I have 2 different selves here, my deeper authentic self and then my ego self. Do I have a duty to my authentic self not to allow my ego self to run the show, right? To infect my flow of consciousness? So now I got 3 people up here deciding to act in fidelity to my authentic self to manage my ego self. I'm using the word self a few too many times, so I'd rather minimize that usage. So I try to make it easier on myself to teach it. I make a distinction between, when I talk about the deeper authentic self, I want to take the word self out for it, mostly for pedagogic reasons. I'm going to call it the soul. Now, you don't have to believe in God to believe you have a soul. I don't mean the immortal soul. I just mean a deep part of us. You may say where our deepest Self is developed around our core values. I include love, justice, truth, and beauty. As James Hillman says, the soul is where meaning is worked out. It's the deep part of us that's responding to what I'm going to call life upon the surface, but it needs help from the conscious self, and I'm going to call this the higher self. So it's a teaching I've offered many times before, but it's especially valuable in teaching resilience, in teaching duty, that you have a duty to your soul. And by soul, I mean something like your authentic self, or what I'm going to call the becoming self, not who you are, but that which you want to become as something of inherent value. Now, not value that's something you prize, like I value my education. You can be moral or immoral and be an educated person. Or I value having a prosperous life. Well, you can be prosperous and be immoral or moral. There are certain values that are inherently moral, and I think flourishing as a human being as much as possible is one of them. So to say I'm flourishing as a human being, but I'm immoral, the words don't go together for me, because I have a value sense of flourishing as a human being, which means also flourishing in my moral character, don't cause harm to other people, and also flourishing in my spiritual character, which is allow myself to live in such a way where I'm maximizing joy and minimizing misery. Now, so when I sometimes say to people, you have a spiritual obligation to minimize your misery, that surprises people. In fact, it's contrary to what I learned when I was a young person. In these many classes we had where we compared Judaism and Christianity, and Judaism always looked good and Christianity always looked bad. They say Judaism is focused on ethics and not feelings, and Christianity is focused on loving other people, and that's something you can't control, but you can be moral. Well, A, it's not true, because Judaism says love your neighbor as yourself, so we do have emotions that are commanded. But the inner life of feelings and emotions, in our tradition, especially the Hasidic tradition, is understood to be a realm of duty. I have a duty to my soul not to languish in misery. And therefore, when a person notices, well, let's say they're managing the wall of virtue, it doesn't get out, but internally they feel angry, resentful, guilt, shame, etc., including unrelenting grief. Do they have a duty to work through the grief? Do they have a duty to work through the helplessness? Now, I'm not saying it can be worked through. Some grief is so severe that we can't work it through. We will be scarred, maybe emotionally disabled the rest of our lives. I'm not saying that's not true. Some people are constituted in such a way where they just can't provide the will to use the skills to live up to the duty of a flourishing life. So that's not because a person is a bad person. If a person can't, they can't. As I sometimes say, you can't. People say, "Well, why can't my wife, husband, child, parent do this thing?" And I say, it's like asking someone with a bad knee to run a marathon. They have a bad knee; they can barely walk, they can't run. So when you say, "Why can't they?" They have the emotional equivalent of a bad knee or a bad foot. So quit asking them to do what they can't do, and quit judging them for it. And I want to say that to ourselves as well. Part of what self-knowledge is knowing your envelope. Knowing, according to your personality, your past, everything totaled together, what are you capable of? That's the first part of transformation. And within that, can you push your vision for yourself within your capacity? Now, many people, I've learned, don't act according to their capacity because they haven't decided. And they haven't decided because one thing about that person is something in them says, I don't want to be hard on myself. I don't want to be virtuous. I don't want the struggle and the pain of being a virtuous person. They choose the easy way out. I oftentimes share an anecdote where a couple of people were really upset with each other because one person had done something to a mutual friend that was really not right. And so I'll say Reuben was upset with Simon because Simon said something terrible to Levi. So Reuben says, Simon has to apologize. And so, so Reuben says, go talk to the rabbi. So I'm sitting with, I'll call Simon, being the person who's committed an offense and doesn't want to apologize. They said, well, I don't really understand this apologizing thing. I said, well, would you like me to explain what an apology is? He says, okay, I know what an apology is. I mean, I don't understand why people have to apologize. We do what we do, and people get over it, they don't get over it. And I don't think I should have to apologize. I said, okay, so I'm going to make a case that you do have an obligation to apologize. And we talked for a while, and he realized from a human nature perspective, if we live in a moral universe and you offend somebody, you have a natural duty to apologize if you live in a moral universe. And the person heard me out very patiently and said, you know what? Maybe I'm not a moral person. Maybe I'm not a moral person. And I don't desire to be a moral person when it comes to apologies. I'm just going to stay like I am. Now, when the first person, Reuben, heard about this, he was aghast, because then the three of us spoke. And Simon had now become very articulate. He said, I don't want to be a moral person when it comes to apologies. I've decided. Now, Reuben said, well, that's not permissible. I mean, it's not that hard. I mean, you can write down an apology. You don't have to mean it that deeply, but it's something that you always says, well, I'm not doing it. Now, their friendship ended, and they had a pretty good friendship. But once Simon came out with, I probably could, I just don't want to. Why? It went past what we'll call his comfort zone. So many of us have the capacity to do things far beyond our comfort zone, but we prefer our comfort zone. I'm giving that as an analogy, a behavioral analogy to what goes on inside of people. Many times the bad habits that we have, and we're not resilient, for example, against fear, depression, catastrophizing, and the other ones, resentment, guilt. There's many things that go on. So the first thing I ask a person, even in the environment today where people say, well, this is Germany 1934, I say, actually, it's not, and I can demonstrate that to you factually and historically, that this is not Germany 1934. And they say, okay, because I'm teacher of the Holocaust, so I know what happened in Germany between 1919 and 1934. The French occupation of the Ruhr, the communist takeover of Bavaria, the destruction of the German economy, and the fact that it was the actual state itself that was behind anti-Semitism, not a bunch of rabble-rousers, many of whom are Islamists taking advantage of American freedom. It's just not an analogy. So a person says, okay, you're right. You're right. Now, you've shown to me it is not analogous. It's something else entirely. I said, okay. And they say, but I don't know why I need to catastrophize. I hear everything you're saying, and I will probably go out here thinking, it's Germany in 1934. I said, well, I can talk to you about that. I can talk to you about catastrophizing because my trying to persuade you intellectually that they are simply not analogous does not address the human tendency to catastrophize. The person said, okay, good point. There's a difference. My first question is, do you want not to catastrophize? Do you will yourself not to catastrophize? Can you imagine yourself a person being, when you think about the world, you think about it in a rational, factual way. When you find something wrong, you can mobilize yourself into a course of action. But catastrophizing is not good. And I'll give you a basic rule why. It's called a rule of spiritual economy. You only want to give things as much energy as they need to make them better. Catastrophizing is taking an imaginary problem and funding it with a huge amount of energy, which of course is all wasted and dissipated. We don't have an endless dynamo. We don't have an endless battery. Right? It just is like the economics of scarcity. If you spend money on one thing, you can't spend it on another thing. For most of us who live with limited amount of money, same thing with your emotions, same with your feelings, and the same thing with your thoughts. When you spend your thoughts, feelings, on emotions on something that doesn't exist, but you're doing it out of hatred, of animosity, out of anger, out of rage, or the tendency to catastrophize, whatever you're doing, it's wasted energy that you could put elsewhere. Now, many people say, I want to hate. I mean, I think we were talking about the enemies of Israel today. They want to hate. They don't want to be talked out of it, right? Hate is their comfort zone. For me, it's become a kind of a religion of hatred. It's not worth talking to them, right? So I don't, again, think we should dissipate our energy on hard-headed, hating people. We've got to immunize other people from their being persuaded by them. I also try to take this attitude toward like the news that I hear lately. I don't want to hear any more people criticizing Israel, criticizing the Israeli government. I know the strengths, I know the faults. I just don't want to hear about it all day because people are so mean. They are they're unrelenting in their hatred. And I don't want to be infected with it. I don't want that. I won't get infected, but I don't want to spend the energy of having to fight it off because it makes me sad, it even depresses me. I'm saying to myself, I just got, I'll look at the headline, I'll go to the next thing. There's a few thoughtful people that I love to read because I feel better when I read thoughtful people. But when I look at the Hindu idea that everything is food, everything that you ingest, what you see, what you hear, what you read, what you think about, it's all a kind of a nourishment for the ego self. And some of it is very bad for you. It's junk food. It's poisonous, but we ingest it anyway. So that's another kind of resilience, the resilience against being indiscriminate about what we take in to our inner ecosystem, and then the energy we have to take to get it out of us. So in thinking about resilience, all kinds of resilience, any kind of resilience, in my four steps to, I'll say, allow for a meaningful life. Think in terms of duty. Duty to others to be moral. It's a pretty absolute duty. Not to cause harm to the innocent. And just assume the people in your family, however much they annoy you, the duty not to harm them through anger, etc., is absolute. Whatever's going on, whatever you got to work out, anger and toxic behavior is not going to help. It's an a priori duty. Now, if you do it, you can just say, I'm not up to doing my duty. I'm going to start again tomorrow. Okay, I have a duty. I want to be a virtuous person. I failed today. I'm going to work at it again tomorrow. You don't say I don't have a duty because they did it the 11th time. Like 10 times I have a duty, 11th time I don't have a duty. No, you actually have a duty on the 11th time as well. So do your duty. By the way, I was, many of you remember, there's a point in my life where I was 50 pounds heavier than I am today. Back in, I guess around 2000, if anybody remembers 2000, 2001. Well, how'd that happen? Well, I was overworked, I was stressed, but I ate, that's how I figured it out, one extra piece of bread a day. Okay, 100 calories. 100 calories in a month is 3,000 calories if I'm doing my math right. 3,000 calories is a pound of fat. In a year, that's 12 pounds of fat. And after 3 years, it's 36 pounds of fat because I'm eating the equivalent of one extra piece of bread a day. And I suddenly found myself, I was strong. I used to lift weights. I was like a biker. And I thought to myself, I'm going to die. And I almost did from the damage I did to myself. So one thing I did for myself, for many reasons, I began training in Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu in 2000, 50 pounds overweight. And how'd I do it? 45-year-old guy, who's out of shape, overweight. Nothing says that I should go into a gym filled with guys half my age and fight them. Don't have any cardio. I decided. And I talked to the instructor. I said, how long does it take to get a black belt? He says, that's not a good question. The question is, are you deciding to train? Because if you're deciding to train, I'll give you all the attention in the world. If you haven't decided yet, tell me, because I'm not going to take you seriously. And I remember looking at myself, going home, talking to me, Rob. I said, am I deciding? Because I think my life might be at stake. And I'd like to learn how to fight like these Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu guys in the UFC, not the karate guys who all got beat up. He said, yeah, we evaluated, we thought about it. We thought about what my goal was. Yeah, I did it. So I began training, 45 years old, 50 pounds overweight. I decided. So where did I have the fight of my life? Okay, now I'm being very personal and very vulnerable because some of you understand what I'm saying. The biggest fight of my life during that time was not in the studio. I mean, I never won a match for 18 months, but that was okay. I didn't mind tapping out because I was ecstatic to be on the mat. I was ecstatic, sparring. The misery was in front of the refrigerator because I had a habit of, whenever I'm bored, I just open the refrigerator and I grab something. I said to myself, not doing that anymore. So I remember, okay, I'll open the refrigerator and I'll either eat something healthy or nothing at all. And that was virtue, and that's where the demons came out. I said, wow, you guys are strong. You know it's not good for me. You know you're going to kill me. You know it's all going to be bad, but you want to anyway. They say, yeah, we want to. We want to feel good. We want some sugar. You're making us feel bad. And I said, well, you're going to have to feel bad because I don't want to die. Now, the heart attack that I did have 6 years later would have been catastrophic and I think deadly had I not been training in jiu-jitsu for 6 years. I think I would not have survived that heart attack I had in 2006. Now, I'm being vulnerable. I'm being self-revelatory because this idea of resilience, in my mind, comes from a decision. Whatever your thing is, whether it's some kind of addictive behavior, drugs, alcohol, overeating, et cetera, emotional addictions, including catastrophizing, holding on to anger, resentment, whatever the deal is, you can go to your higher self and you can see it's not good for you. It might be a habit. It might be a very ingrained habit. But when you go to your higher self, you know it's not good for you. I want to speak to those, all of us who have experienced grievous wounds. That's something in the ego self does not want to get over. It wants to hold on to grievance. I used to call this the reliquary of wounds. It's as if the unconscious ego self takes these grievances and puts them in a reliquary and shines them up. So if you have a bad argument again, you can say, yeah, but what about what you did 10 years ago? Open the reliquary, being out that stone. I've been shining the stone for a long time to use it right now in this argument as my what about. Okay, you want to say something about me? What about this? And people preserve this reliquary to bring these evil, toxic stones out and make sure they can use them and throw them in a particularly tough moment so they can get a victory. And I've had them. Other people have them. And then you have the will, the vision, the will, and the skill not to do that anymore. I call it the whatabouts. People get bad cases of the whatabouts. I said, when you have a grievance and the other person's not being fair to you, and they're demanding something of you they don't demand of themselves, and you have a perfect example when they didn't do it, the urge, desire to open up the evil reliquary and bring out a what about is profound. Now, you've all been there. Now, what about the virtue of not using what about? If you've gone off the honor path, you've gone off the honor path. There are no what abouts in the honor path. Meaning somebody else not acting honorably does not license me not to act honorably because my honor is my thing, whatever somebody else does. Remember, it doesn't matter what they do. What matters is the kind of person I want to be. So just in sum for all of this, in my mind, a core part of resilience, not all of resilience, is first of all, duty, meaning virtue. Duty and virtue elicit the demons. Then we have a duty to the soul to work through and heal the inner life, whatever our bad habits are, whether they're physical, interpersonal, or just internal, because we have a duty to the soul to live flourishing lives. Now, once you know you have a duty, once it's an absolute duty, then you have two questions. I think only two questions. How do I cultivate the will and keep it active and make sure it doesn't get depleted? And how do I cultivate the skills? So when people, I think, are falling back, my question is, well, did your will get depleted? Are you using your skills? Do you need a new set of skills? So I hope you found this helpful. I don't think it addresses all of life's problems, but it addresses many of them, especially in do your duty, find happiness, and when you're not happy, be resilient. And then you'll find in this life of duty, happiness, and resilience, all kinds of little things matter because they will help you do your duty, they will bring joy to life, and they will help you be resilient.